For more than a century, a small community of Germans lived, worked, and thrived in Georgia. They built villages, planted vineyards, opened schools, and brought new skills that left a lasting imprint on the country's culture and economy. Yet today, the story is almost forgotten. War, repression, and forced deportation erased much of their presence from the land, leaving behind only traces: abandoned houses, fading gravestones, and scattered memories. But their contributions remain woven into Georgia's history, from architecture to agriculture, from education to winemaking. This is the story of the Germans of Georgia, once strangers who became part of the country's fabric, and whose legacy, though nearly erased, still lives on. Welcome to The Forgotten Tale, the story of the Germans of Georgia. The history of the German settlement of Georgia is tightly linked to the annexion of the region by the Russian Empire from the late 18th century to the mid-19th century. In 1804, Tsar Alexander I of Russia issued a manifesto inviting foreigners to settle in newly acquired lands to boost the agricultural development and engineering of these new marshlands of the empire through the immigration of skilled workers.
The Tsarist Empire just conquered parts of the Southern Caucasus or the Eastern Georgian kingdom of Kartli Kakheti, and they needed foodstuff for feeding their army, and the productivity of local agriculture of local Georgian peasants was not high enough really to meet this demand. And then they remembered the experience from the internal colonization of central Russian regions, Volga Basin.
With this policy, Alexander followed his famous grandmother's, Catherine the Great, footsteps, who in 1762 and 1763 invited non-Jewish Europeans to immigrate and become Russian subjects, as well as farm Russian lands, while maintaining the language and culture, leading to the establishment of German settlers in the Volga region. In Georgia, Alexander I's manifesto attracted Germans coming from the southwest of Germany, in what was then the Kingdom of Württemberg.
So I prefer to talk about Swabians because there was no united Germany in the beginning of the 19th century when Germany was suffering from the Napoleonic Wars, so tax burdens to overcome the debts of war that were harassing, and other social, economic problems, and also religious one for the people that came, emigrated from Germany, emigrated from the Kingdom of Württemberg, and especially the region of Swabia.
The Tsar's manifesto particularly appealed to Swab pietists seeking religious freedom. This branch of Lutheranism that emerged in the late 17th century sought to renew the spiritual life of the church, which many believed had become overly intellectual and rigid. This position led this group to distance themselves from the Lutheran Church and was dubbed separatist, as well as persecuted by the state. For these communities, the invitation of the Russian Empire came at just the right time. It offered a fresh start, agricultural land of considerable size, exemption from military service, no taxes for 10 years, and most importantly, full freedom of religion. These powerful incentives drew the southern German pietists to immigrate to the South Caucasus.
Major parts of them were very religious, pietists, so-called separatists that were wanted to be closer to Jerusalem and Mount Ararat, because they were expecting the end of the days, the return of Jesus Christ to earth, and then they wanted to be closer to this. And for the socioeconomic problems, religious convictions made them to opt for emigrating from Swabia, Tübingen, Tuttlingen, Reutlingen, and other places to the Caucasus, and they mainly settled in what is today Georgia and also Azerbaijan, and one settlement in what is today Armenia.
In 1817, around 6,000 Swabians set out from their homeland in southern Germany on the arduous journey to the distant lands of the Caucasus. For many, this decision to leave was not taken lightly. They were abandoning their villages, their families, and the familiarity of home for an uncertain future. Contemporary accounts and later testimonies speak of the deep sorrow of departure, but also of the steadfast hope that sustained the settlers, the belief that beyond the hardships lay the promise of fertile land, freedom to practice their faith, and the chance to build a better life for their children.
It was on the 26th of June, 1817, when my wife, 9 children, and I departed from Kupferzell and had to taste the most bitter pain of leaving.
The immigrant traveled in wagons to the assembly point of the river port in Ulm. The journey of these often overloaded barges lasted for weeks and was even life-threatening at some places on the Danube. In Vienna, they transferred to boats, which took them via Budapest and Belgrade to the Bessarabian-Russian border town of Ismail.
We had to move to a larger ship, but received less space as to accommodate 121 more at 309 people in total.
There, the travelers were held in quarantine. A lack of food and clean water led to epidemics.
Even Leonhard and Albrecht are swollen all over. Margrethe is also beginning to swell, yet Joseph is getting leaner every day. Even Johann has lain down in the bed.
Those who remained spent the first winter in Großliebenthal near Odessa. From there, some families set out again in direction of the Caucasus.
It was cold, as the peaks of the mountains were covered in snow, and the path very steep upwards. The young and sickly had to stay on the wagons, and the rest had to walk and assist the horses. And so we managed it up with all our carriages.
After crossing the mountains, the first immigrants arrived in Tbilisi in September 1817. From around 6,000 Swabians who left Germany in direction of Georgia that year, only half of them arrived alive in Georgia, where Alexander granted them settlement rights. By 1819, there were 6 main German settlements: Marienfeld, Neue Tiflis, Alexandersdorf, Elisabethtal, Petersdorf, and Katharinenfeld. Despite the support of the emperor in the initial years, the colonists ended up in hard social conditions. They fought epidemics and infertility. For the colonies in the 1820s, the goal was merely survival. The situation stabilized during the 1830s, when the number of births exceeded the number of deaths. From the middle of the 1840s, the settlers seemed to have well adjusted to their new circumstances. Agricultural specialization brought increasing sales opportunities in the second half of the 19th century, with a period of economic improvement. The population in German settlements grew significantly, increasing from fewer than 3,000 people in 1819 to approximately 12,000 by the turn of the 20th century. The rapid expansion of German communities and their economic strength led to the creation of satellite settlements. To date, 21 German settlements have been identified in the territory of modern Georgia. Despite this economic growth, the political climate began to deteriorate for Georgia's Germans, as the Russian state gradually revoked the rights initially promised to settlers. Following Alexander II's great reforms, German settlements were being increasingly integrated into the central administration. Key privileges such as self-governance and exemption from military service were abolished in the late 19th century. Pressure was being applied to force the German settlers to assimilate and Russify, as exemplified by Russian becoming the language of instructions in schools. The hostility towards Germans further grew ahead of World War I, reflecting the worsening of international relations between Russia and Germany. It culminated during the war, as Germans in the Russian Empire faced significant hardships, even though they were subjects of the crown. German newspapers were banned, and settlements' names were Russified. German communities were subjected to strict surveillance and to rumors of imminent deportation. Anti-German sentiment led to violent demonstrations in cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, where German-owned businesses were vandalized. As the German Empire advanced on the Eastern Front, the Russian government devised plans to expropriate German settlers' land. However, these plans were never implemented, due to the February Revolution in 1917 and the collapse of the Tsarist regime. In 1820, following a brief period of independence, Georgia was occupied by the Soviet Army and became a Soviet republic. The new authorities imposed harsh measures on Germans and other ethnic groups. During the subsequent decades, many members of the German community were arrested and accused of anti-Soviet activities, followed by an exile to Siberia. Stalin's Great Terror brought immense suffering to the German population. Numerous Germans were convicted in short trials, imprisoned, and sent to forced labor camps. The outbreak of the Second World War marked a turning point for the German colonists in Georgia. Despite having lived in the South Caucasus for generations, and often feeling little direct connection to Germany, they increasingly came under suspicion and were cast as a potential fifth column, branding them traitor and questioning their loyalties. In reality, most of the colonists were far more rooted in local life, working as farmers, craftsmen, traders, than in the politics of a distant homeland.
This Auslandsdeutschtum, this Germans abroad concept, this was something invented really by the German authorities, really to use these emigrants as some kind of a basis for politically influencing the outer world.
Yet, this climate of mistrust laid the groundwork for the harsher measures and stigmatizations to come. These took a turn for the worse when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. In October 1941, a decree ordered the deportation of Germans from Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. This forced around 50,000 Germans to abandon all their possessions except transportable luggages. They were deported to Kazakhstan under military escort, following the fate of the Volga Germans deported earlier that year. The deportations caused widespread malnutrition, disease, and death, separated countless families, orphaned tens of thousands of children, and stripped the German community of civil rights. Many perished during the journey or in the forced labor camps. On arrival, men, women, and even teenagers were placed under the Trudania labor army, where they were compelled to work in mines, forests, construction sites, and collective farms under brutal conditions. Living quarters were primitive, often mud huts, barracks, or makeshift shelters, and food shortages were constant, leading to hunger and malnutrition. Deportees were under strict police surveillance, forbidden to leave assigned areas, and treated with suspicion by local authorities. Families were often separated for years, and children grew up in exile with limited access to education. Despite these conditions, many deportees tried to preserve their traditions, language, and faith, holding clandestine religious gatherings and passing on stories of their old communities in Georgia. Over time, some adapted to local life. The trauma of displacement, loss of home, and the stigma of being labeled enemy nationals left deep scars that lasted for generations. After the Second World War, a cruel cycle of hope and disappointment followed. For years, the Germans dreamt of return. But in 1948, the Soviet state formally deprived them of that right. Even after Stalin's death, restrictions persisted. Through the special settlements were lifted in 1955, their villages remained close to them. In 1964, they were symbolically rehabilitated, but the decree was kept secret. Only in 1972 were they finally granted the legal right to return, but by then, their homes had long been occupied by others. Their churches repurposed, their cemeteries neglected. Some families made their way back to Georgia, clinging to fragments of their past. Yet most remained scattered, building new lives in Kazakhstan or Siberia. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet Union collapsed, many Germans from the Caucasus seized their chance to return to Germany, the land of their distant ancestors. The return was not true homecoming. After more than 150 years in the Caucasus, there were strangers in Germany. They spoke Russian, Georgian, or Azerbaijani, a longer dialect of Swabian few could understand. They knew the vineyards of Bolnisi better than the Rhine, the peaks of the Caucasus better than the Black Forest. In Germany, they are often met as outsiders, Russians rather than long-lost kin. For many, the rupture was doubled. First uprooted from their Caucasian homeland, then estranged in the land of their forefather. This poem by the Caucasian German Allmendinger from Katharinenfeld is a poignant illustration of this.
Far to the south there in the wild Caucasus, where from mossy rocks the clear river rushes, where the proud castles stand on light hills, where in old stones much is to be seen, yes, there was my dear, cherished homeland, where the cradle of our ancient fathers stood. In the middle of the mountains stood my parents' house. There was my homeland, there was my home.
In 1998, the Georgian government formally rehabilitated those who had suffered under Stalin's terror. Yet rehabilitation could not undo exile. For the Germans of Georgia, history had severed them from every homeland. Displaced from the Caucasus they had built and disoriented in the Germany they had never truly known. Although most German families were deported in the 1940s, and only a few ever returned, some still remain in Georgia today, often through the descendants of those who were spared exile. For decades, they carried the stigma of being German, and often felt compelled to hide it. Yet among the older generation, some still speak Swabian, recall life in the former colonies, and remember the fateful day when their neighbors and relatives were forcefully taken from Georgia.
Those who were married to non-Germans who were spared from deportation, they continued to live there. And there is also a book by Tamta Melashvili who interviewed some of these people and gave them a voice. But there are these people and they have their own association. It is called Einung. But this is a group that is diminishing.
In recent decades, awareness about this forgotten past has grown, and efforts were made to preserve the cultural heritage of the Caucasus Germans.
The history of the Germans so far has not been investigated in greater detail. So mainly on Russian language materials, based on Russian language materials. And we are now introducing the German original archival materials that survived in the Georgian National Archives. In that way, really, this is work in progress, really introducing a more thorough study of the history of the German in Georgia and in the Caucasus in the future.
These efforts to reclaim memory extend beyond academic research and discoveries in the archives. They also find a public face in exhibitions, where history becomes tangible for broader audiences. In Bolnici, for example, the local museum has dedicated an entire aisle to the history of the German colonists in Georgia, an important space where artifacts, photographs, and personal stories help weave these experiences back into the country's collective narrative. Beyond reclaiming the memory of these German colonists and raising awareness of their history, another pressing challenge lies in safeguarding the physical legacy, the houses, churches, and communal spaces they left behind. This work is being spearheaded by the Association for the Preservation of German Cultural Heritage in the South Caucasus, which is led by Oliver Heisner.
There is a lot of German heritage left in Georgia in architectural means, which is quite a challenge because Georgia has to cover a lot of cultural heritage of its own, so of its own long history. So there are several thousands of buildings that survived, dwellings that are partly now in private property, and this makes it difficult really because it requires some investment really on how to preserve it. And for the 200th anniversary in 2017, we really inventorized all of the buildings, and there is a book by Nestan Tatarashvili that shares all the findings that we have. We still have to establish a way on how to convince the local population to take care of this heritage, who are themselves not really in a position that they can afford to do that. And therefore, some joint effort will be necessary with Germany, with craftsmen, traveling craftsmen from Germany who are working pro bono, and the local authorities really to create a scheme that makes these houses that they are not falling apart, because we are observing the decay of these buildings. Yeah?
Despite the challenges, the association still boasts several successes, like the Church of Asureti and the Georgian-German wine house of Bolnici, as well as so many more projects currently in the making. The fate of the Caucasus Germans is a tragic tale of flourishing communities uprooted, of families torn from their homes, and of lives scattered across distant lands. Yet, it is also a story that is now being rediscovered. What was once forgotten is finding new voice through restoration, scholarship, and memory. Their legacy is not just one of exile and loss, but of vineyards that shaped regional wine culture, architecture that still marks the landscape, and tradition that quietly wove themselves into Georgian society. Far from being a closed chapter, the history of the Caucasus Germans continued to resonate, revealing a deeper, more complex story of Georgia's development than most realize. To remember them is not only to mourn what was lost, but also to recognize how their presence helped shape the country we see today. Each settlement was unique, each brought something different, and together they helped shape the fabric of modern Georgia in ways still visible today. In the second part of this documentary, we will explore these settlements one by one, uncovering their distinct contributions, their forgotten stories, and the legacies that continue to live on in the heart of the Caucasus.